Let's be brutally honest right now. That's a big question.
I'm looking for someone who doesn't want to go to base camp, but they want to go to the very top.
Whether it's here, India, New York.
Civilization was born at happy hour.
That's what wins. That's what stands out. That's what people are interested in. That's what I want to know. The Hospopreneurs Podcast with James Henderson.
Hello and welcome to the Hospopreneurs Podcast. Making sense of customer data can be unbelievably difficult. Today, David Shukri, Client Service Director at Shopper Intelligence, joins me to discuss exactly this. With over a decade of experience helping retailers and manufacturers navigate data to innovate, David has found himself focusing his interests on the Australian liquor industry to distill complexity and navigate the noise to generate actionable insights. I'd been following David on LinkedIn for a while before we sat down to record this episode, but I'm really glad that we did get the chance to, and I hope that you enjoy listening as much as I enjoyed recording. Hello and welcome to the show, David.
Hi James, how you doing?
Very well, thank you. Very well. Thank you for joining me on the program today. We couldn't line up anywhere else, so we're in the State Library of Victoria. People will see anyone who's watching the video today. We don't normally do video, so we've got some video for this episode for those who want to check that out.
It's great. It's a great location, actually.
I think it's pretty amazing. Not sponsored by them or anything. It's literally just us talking about the State Library, but it's a great space. David, the first question that I like to ask on the program is a crazy hospitality story or exceptional hospitality experience. I'd love to know what you've brought to the program today.
Yes, and I have been deliberating this since you first put it to me, knowing that this was coming up, and my last minute final decision is to go down this route, and it's probably going to keep my wife happy as well, because my final choice is actually a memory or an experience that goes back to when I proposed to her. And we were on holiday in Italy, and this had been something that I had told her that if and when I ever proposed to someone, I would do it in Positano in Italy. And very famous place. You may have seen these kind of picture postcards of this crazy multicolored landscape cut into the side of the hill, and that is Positano. And so I was due to pop the question. Found this little cafe, happened to be called Cafe Positano, and we were sitting literally in this picture postcard setting. And it was everything that I imagined. Amazing experience, beautiful, just looking out over the bay. When I got down on my knee and I did the whole traditional piece, everybody stopped, everybody was watching, taking photos. The staff in the place had come over and there was a big kerfuffle. And it was wonderful. And it was actually only when I was suggesting to my wife that this was a great experience that she said, "Oh yeah, but do you remember what happened?" And I went, "No, why? What happened apart from the obvious?" She said, "Well, do you remember that the staff brought us over these couple of Kir Royales to sort of celebrate?" And I actually said, "No, I have no recollection of that, to be honest." But she went, "Oh, you
were focused on other things at the time."
I was focused on other things, yes. Yeah. I was still wiping the tears from my eyes. And so she goes, "Yeah, they brought over these Kir Royales." And we were like, "Oh, that's amazing. That's really nice. That's so great of you." And then they brought the bill over at the end, and these Kir Royales were on the bill.
Oh, no. No.
Really undid the work and the great gesture. And we were like, "That's incredible."
Oh, no. That's a shame. It is a crazy story. Is there more to it?
Well, we got married after the end of it, so it didn't take the shine off it.
Ending.
Happy ending. And we still got this photo of us sitting at this table. But I suppose the twist is that I'd completely forgotten about that until she mentioned it. And I'd only remembered the great experience and the wonderful view and the setting and everything else. And then she goes, "Yeah, what about these Kir Royales?" And I went, yeah, that probably wasn't the most sort of customer-focused thing they could have done, But having said all that, I've still also got the little card that says Cafe Positano and all the rest of it, and a couple of stones from the beach and everything. So it worked out all right for them. But now I've told everyone Cafe Positano will charge you potentially for those Kir Royales if you go and get engaged there.
Wow. But you've got the memento, you've got the postcard. Did you keep the bill as a memento as well?
Yeah, I should have done. And I should send it to them annually on the anniversary and say, "I want those Kir Royales back."
Oh, wow. That is a crazy story. Thank you for sharing that one, David. And you mentioned there that it's not necessarily the most customer-centric thing. And I'm sort of alluding to the work that you're doing now. A lot of the work that you do is very much customer-centric. I'd like to open that up a little bit more. But just before I do, I like to ask guests why they do what they do. So I'm looking for a more abstract, even philosophical answer to your question that really drives you. Why do you do what you do?
Yeah, your questions are very good, James. They really do make you think about what your life is all about.
Thanks, David.
You've done this a few times, I know.
171 published episodes.
Yeah.
There are many more that didn't make the cut as well. So I've asked it a lot of times.
And hopefully what I say is of some value compared to some of the other answers.
It will be.
I'm very deeply interested in connecting dots. I find that the world does a lot of analysis and it doesn't do as much synthesis and synthesizing. It's another random story. I went for a job interview with a French company once, and it was the first time really that somebody outside of a biology teacher mentioned synthesis to me. And it was this French guy saying, which do you prefer, analysis or synthesis? And I garbled something and babbled something, but I've sort of later come to realize actually that synthesis is about taking those things that you've broken out of the analysis and building it back into something new, which is the whole connecting the dots bit. And so going back in my career, I worked in retail and I was a buyer and I had some great experiences with that, but something was kind of missing out of all of that. I learned a lot of good skills about negotiation and relationships and this kind of thing, but there was something about connecting the dots that was missing. And I kind of wanted to have the opportunity, I suppose, to see the bigger picture and to see what was off on the other pieces of the map, and then to have the opportunity to help people to bring those things together and to tell better stories and to do better things ultimately for their customers. We are all a customer at some point in our life. From the point of view of what the industry I work in, groceries, liquor, on-premise, is all stuff that people really care about. Food and drink, massively important to all of us, different guises. And so that's really nice, and a really nice human connection. Whenever I go to a dinner party, and this started off when I worked for a UK retailer, people thought I worked in store, which was fine. But I said, look, talk to me. Tell me about your experiences, because it touches everyone. And I still find that today.
David, I imagine a lot of buyers have the same sort of problem or difficulty or challenge when they meet new people. People might think that they're just at the checkout. But I imagine that you've met a lot of people in that time as a buyer. For listeners who don't know, aren't familiar with the retail space and FMCG or CPG, what is a buyer?
Well, essentially, what I was responsible for was the sales, the profit, the margin for a particular category or a group of categories. So it's a pretty big responsibility. There can be some really big numbers on that. And quite often buyers are pretty young. This was going back sort of 20 odd years in my life. I was certainly a lot younger than I am today when I was doing that job. So there's a lot of responsibility. I guess in some ways you could see it as being the MD of a small business. I mean, we're working for a big retailer. That would be the size of what you're responsible for. And you're coordinating a lot of different things. There's the relationships with your suppliers, there's internal pressures, there's internal responsibilities. Depending on which category, there's manufacturing cycles to understand. There could be production. There could be life cycles, depending on, again, what category you're in. So there's a lot of plates to be spinning. And then you factor in things like what's going on in stores, and you get to actually spending time out in stores, looking at your categories, understanding what your shoppers see and how they experience it and how they're feeling. And certainly when I was doing it, there probably wasn't as much access to shopper information, lots of consumer information, which is really important. But then and I would do this often, I would ask suppliers, well, what's the experience like for my shopper in my store? And things sometimes got a little bit hazy and a little bit grey at that stage. But it was a lot of fun. The negotiation side of things, I got to go and see a lot of fascinating things. I worked on poultry and live animals, should we say. So I got to see a lot of things that you probably wouldn't get to see, generally speaking. But also, it's difficult because it can be quite adversarial. And I certainly found a little bit isolated at times, trying to get a good gauge on what was really going on in the world. And that was that thing, as I said, that was missing for me. I wanted to see a bigger picture.
I imagine 20 years ago, there was less data around these decisions that you're making as well. Can we connect that up? I'm trying to understand how what you do now is very different to that in how you advise those sorts of people and those sorts of businesses in how they should make their decisions.
Well, yeah, absolutely. For one, business that I work for today, Shopper Intelligence, didn't exist 20 years ago, and that would have been a great help in its own right. Just for the fact that we're talking to a massive number of shoppers and drinkers throughout the year across a whole number of categories and a whole number of locations. So there's a lot of information. But I also remember even things like loyalty card data was in its infancy back then. and having access to that information as buyers through online portals was in its infancy. It makes me feel really old, actually, saying this, but we were kind of like, wow, there's this online portal and it's going to show us who's buying what and in what basket and what else is going in the basket and all this sort of stuff. But that's evolution. And in an interesting sort of way, thinking about what people tell me is happening in the on-premise still now, sometimes still probably feels a little bit like that for them because they haven't got the same access to the same wealth. You could almost argue in grocery there's too much information. People say they'd never come now to me and say, we haven't got enough data, give us some more. Then it becomes about synthesizing it and turning it back into a story. But in the on-premise, it's still often this big black hole. And operators, venue owners, suppliers are desperate for somebody to shine a torch on it.
Certainly in the retail space, the data is available to those who can afford it too. In my experience, it is incredibly expensive to access that data as well. I won't quote any figures because it's probably going to increase by the time the episode comes out, even if it's in a few weeks. But that data is excellent when you do get it. I've certainly, in my experience, worked with data that, that Woolworths and Coles produce, and it's awesome. So totally understand that. Talk us through what shopper intelligence does and then how that's different and how, where you sit in the market.
Yeah, definitely. Without getting into the cost side of things, shopper intelligence is about why people behave the way they do. And it's about giving people the opportunity to do better business together. That's a really powerful premise, a really powerful driver around collaboration, better planning, better activation in order to achieve and grow and succeed.
Totally. There are absolutely benefits despite there being the costs that I mentioned before. So please continue.
Yeah, sure. No, there are. What's the expression go? There are costs to play, I suppose, in different data sets. And there are many different data sets out there. But look, I think what shopper intelligence is really about is saying that whether you're talking grocery or liquor or on-premise or off-premise, it's not a project because your shoppers and your drinkers are there day in, day out. You would never consider doing occasional research into consumers. And it's the same really with shoppers and drinkers and patrons in venues. It's a continuous thing. And if you want to get the best results, then you need to have that on hand. And it needs to be part of your processes. And the other really important thing, and this is something that's really valuable and really held close to the heart in terms of shopper intelligence, is this kind of rule about having a broader view than just your own view. So it's really important to understand what's going on in your own category or in your own venue or in beer or in spirits. But there's real power in understanding what's going on outside that as well. Because if you strip it back, how else do you know if what you're proposing or what you're thinking you're doing is special, an anomaly, something different, or just a reflection of what should be happening in every other part of the venue or the store? So that context is really important. And that's something that obviously goes back to cost. You can't necessarily do that with all data sets just because there are different investments to be made. But something that's really important for us is the ability to make that comparison. And just because you're in beer, let's say, doesn't mean that you shouldn't be able to see what's going on in wine or spirits or ready to drink.
And when I made that comment before about, or you said the cost to play and the cost associated, I'm not going to focus on the price of it, but rather that what I've seen is it's very difficult to get lateral or adjacent data. You usually get category or subcategory specific data, and it's really hard to access anything else without paying for everything individually. In my own experience, I'd love to know from you if that's different or if that's something shopper intelligence does. I'd like you to elaborate on that.
No, well, look, I think that's a perfectly valid kind of supposition. And in liquor, definitely what we've always set out to do is say that, and it's probably specific maybe almost to the Australian market, we have an industry, if we think about the off-premise liquor market, where it's got to be sold in a particular way, in a particular location and so forth. So there is this place where you go to buy all your liquor. It's not the same in the UK, it's not the same in New Zealand. And so even if you are in beer or cider or spirits, in the bigger context of things, you are competing against other categories. You are competing against what's going on in spirits. Yes, we know that most purchases in the off-premise are planned. So I decide what category I'm going to buy before I go into the store. Not all, but most. But it's absolutely sensible, I think, to expect and to want and to be able to look outside your own shelf and for that matter, your own little section of the bar. And so that's absolutely something that we believe really passionately is in liquor in particular, being able to get that holistic view. And as an example, there's somebody I was talking to not so long ago wanted to understand what was going on in that adjacent piece of space. They thought that there was an opportunity there. They'd seen potentially some opportunity in a different data set, but they had no evidence to suggest what drinkers were doing there, what shoppers were doing there. And that's something that was really powerful and really great to be able to shine a light on.
David, in a couple of your answers, you've talked about the on-premise. Can you elaborate on what work you do in that space and what sort of data is actually available to on-premise operators?
Well, there is stuff out there. There are sources and there are avenues that people have to go down to try and find some information in the on-premise.
It's sounding a bit spooky. So
yeah. Like I said, it's a big dark hole, generally speaking. And for obvious reasons, there's lots of different operators. There are people who are just a single venue. There are big groups out there as well. And you've also got big manufacturers as well as small manufacturers playing. So it's a patchwork of bits and pieces of information. But I always come back to this idea that it's a big black hole. And what I'm really, I suppose, on a mission to do is say, we can shine a torch on that. We can show what is going on in the on-premise in a way that is going to add value. And there's a lot of, how can I put it, kind of motherhood statements that some in the research industry are putting out there. Things, I saw something recently, for example, talking about how people like to go to pubs to watch sporting events. And you go, yeah, okay, I get that. More interestingly would be to know why. Why do they do that? And what are they doing when they're there? And so having a source of information that goes into those whys and also goes into, if you like, the white space. So it's great to look backwards and say, well, somebody went here and bought this. Great, you need to know that, but you need to know why they did it. And also it'd be great, wouldn't it, to know what could you do differently or what could you do more of in the future to either replicate a good result or to get an even better result. And so that also is one of the premises of Shopper Intelligence. We aim to be a forward-looking source in terms of guiding towards this white space. And that's very much what we do in the on-premise as well. Talking to real drinkers and getting under the skin of, okay, so you bought beer, great. Now tell us what you think about beer in different venues. Now tell us why you were more or less inclined to do what you did in that category.
You've touched on a little bit there, but just so people can understand the reliability of that sort of data that you're getting, can you tell us about the process of how you actually collect that data so that we know it's legitimate?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's very simple. It's an online survey. We sample a representative selection of cross-section of society who have drunk in a variety of venues, bars, pubs, clubs, restaurants, and so forth, over a set period of time. They have to have done it very recently. And this is really important as well. I don't know if you can remember, James, the last time you were having a drink. Maybe you can, maybe it's a bit hazy, I don't know. I can't really remember the last time I was out in a bar, if it was anything more than a couple of weeks ago. So recency is really important, and that's something that we hold really dear. And also the idea that I will only quiz you on one experience that you actually had. So I will ask what you drank, where you drank it. And that is the whole thing that I will then probe you on in this online survey for 15 minutes. Understand the basic attitude that you had towards that drink in that venue. And then we can tease out how that would have been different in a pub versus a club versus a restaurant. We're then going on into questions around how satisfied you were with that and what was important to you even. So really kind of fundamental stuff, because actually it turns out that if you buy beer in an RSL, you've got very different perceptions of what's important and what you want out of that experience than if you buy it in a bar. And that runs the same across all different kinds of drinks, and also depends on your age and your demographic and so on and so forth. So there's so many different stories within that. And then there's some really fascinating stuff around, well, what role did something like the drinks list play? Did I look at a drinks list? How would I like it to be laid out? So you start to be able to create this really rich picture of what you actually experienced, and also how it's different in different venues and how it's different, let's say, in vodka versus gin.
David, where are you experiencing friction at the moment? It's deliberately a broad question.
Ooh, that is a good question. There's something that's coming up again and again and again, and that is the extent to which shoppers or drinkers, in this case, are focused on and interested in price. So whether there's friction or not, there is certainly some degree of disconnect in light of what's going on in the economy and in light of what we kind of get fed, in my view at least, by the mass media, which is doom and gloom because that's what sells. So I understand that. They've got a job to do. That's fine. But what that sort of translates into is an overbearing belief that all of us, all of the time, are focused on something being cheap. And we do know that price is incredibly important. And whether you're a venue or a grocer or a liquor store, you can't afford to lose on price. However, we also know that drinkers tell us there are occasions when they will be prepared to pay more. There are occasions when they will look for something more premium. And that is an interesting tension, I think. And it's an interesting opportunity for suppliers and their trading partners and venues to really have this kind of adult-to-adult conversation that says, okay, again, going back to that bit around the broad context, let's look at everything we have available and really understand, where does drinker X want value in the sort of purest sense of the word, and where are they looking for, shall we say, value for money? Because if we start talking about value for money, that's a very different proposition, because what's value for money for you
Exactly.
could be very different for me. It might be all about health and provenance and ingredients. And for you, it might be...
Does it look cool?
Yeah, does it look cool?
Did someone see that bottle getting picked off the shelf?
Exactly. Yes, brand, for instance.
It's interesting that you say that, because I remember first year economics talking about Veblen goods being upward sloping demand. And so it's this idea that people are willing to pay more as the price increases, because normally demand is downward sloping. And so it's this idea that if you increase the price, more people will buy it instead of less. So that really resonates with me as an interesting idea. And so I won't mention any brands specifically, but your premium brands out there, the top, that's what they do. They increase the price, and the data seems to say that more people buy them. At least that's why we were being taught this in early economics. So interesting that you mentioned that. Obviously, the first choice in tools that on-premise businesses can use is going to be the business that you work with. Are there other tools that you recommend that businesses use to really get rich quality data to make their decisions?
Well, this comes back to this idea that the black hole. I think the on-premise is a very difficult space. You have lots of different providers of different pieces of technology, lots of different EPOS systems. You have, if you're a venue, you have lots of different suppliers talking to you about category and brand and what you should and shouldn't be doing. So I don't envy you if you're in that position. But I think what it just comes back to, if I could pull that back a little bit, is the idea of connecting dots and ensuring that you've got broad enough context. I think that it's very important to have an objective view of what drinkers say. I say objective because you just want to make sure that it hasn't been slanted in one way or another. It wants to be nationally representative. It wants to be as untouched as possible. I think there's also clearly an important aspect around what was sold. You want to know what's gone through till and what has been rung through in terms of volumes, obviously. But that bit around, well, how do people feel about the experience? We get much more of this in grocery. We've got the loyalty cards. We've got scan data, we've got what we call panel data. So there's a whole bunch of different things. And because of the fragmented nature of on-prem, it just doesn't come through in nice, neat little packages. So you have to build this sort of more patchwork quilt of information, connecting different dots and trying to plug together different pieces of the jigsaw.
And it's often smaller operators who have to do all that piecing together, unless there's a large enough group that you can hire someone to fulfill that sort of role, to be looking at the data and make better decisions with it. So it's a very difficult space to be in, to be trying to actually reverse engineer that and Frankenstein your model of what the customer really looks like and their experience in the venue. I'd like to ask you something that seems to be happening at the moment. Certainly, I've seen it a lot over the last few years, definitely since COVID. A lot of on-premise brands moving into retail. I don't know if that's been happening more or if I'm just noticing it more, but I'd love to ask your opinion on what you're seeing there, because it feels like it's the case. I get pitched by brands all the time that are launching XYZ, canned this, bottled that, packaged this, etc. Is that actually happening, or is more? It is. Okay.
It is happening. I would definitely say that is a fascinating space. I'm glad you asked that question because, there's real crossover there. There is real crossover. And this is something that when I talk to my customers, we can talk about off-prem and we can talk about on-prem in an isolated way. But actually what we also do is talk to on-premise drinkers and we ask them specifically, would you be willing and interested to buy that brand in the opposite channel? And would you also be prepared to pay more for the off-premise thing that you usually buy in the on-prem, even if it was charged at a premium? Both of those things have increased, interestingly. It's not just in one direction, it's in both directions. So there is really a very interesting opportunity there to connect the two. So where you are seeing it and where we do see it, it could make a lot of sense. Now, again, it comes down to the particular dynamics in your category and which kind of drinker you're targeting. But at a total level, yes, across the channel, there are big opportunities there.
What sort of opportunities?
Well, instead of looking at it as one channel versus the other, or we have a strategy for one and we have a strategy for the other, with that information, the insight is we can connect those two. And so activity that we might be doing in the off-premise, which we think is going to drive somebody into a liquor store, actually could have much bigger impact in driving sales in the on-prem and vice versa. So all of a sudden, you're not looking at two different, almost competing businesses or competing business units. And you're also not necessarily looking at two completely different sets of activations, two completely different sets of marketing. There are very, very strong crossovers, particularly pronounced in wine. I remember actually a couple of years ago, I was talking to a client presenting back the findings in the on-premise. And when I got to this point about the extent to which wine drinkers were willing to pay that premium for a retail brand, the guys went, that's the one. We want that. That's the one we're taking to the venues to really get the point across that there are some consistencies across range. There are some better opportunities that we have to be consistent. It's not one offer over here and one offer over there. So I guess that, again, just comes back to these ideas of connecting the dots, synthesizing information, and just having a more holistic perspective. Because realistically, it's much like when we talk about Coles and Woolies shoppers. There is crossover here. In a lot of cases, same in terms of on and off premise. We go to a liquor store, we also might drink at a venue. This openness, this knowledge gives us real power to be more efficient, to collaborate better, and also to then start to support the on-premise in particular, because you know that some of that activity that's going on in the off can cross-pollinate and can cross over.
What other changes are you seeing? What's innovating in the space in this same sort of way?
Well, look, I think the really important one to call out is that overall drinkers have told us that they're more satisfied, again, in the on-premise. So satisfaction dipped coming out of COVID. And I've heard you talking to other people on your podcast, James, about some of the challenges that the on-prem has gone through. Massive upheaval, clearly, shortage of staff, and then new staff coming into the sector. And that was noticed over the last sort of going back 2 years. Now we've seen a really interesting step back up again. Going to the numbers, but we see overall satisfaction amongst drinkers in the on-premise is higher actually than it is in the off-premise, which is fascinating. I haven't seen that over the last few years. Now, associated to that, we then start to see different dynamics coming into play, particularly around, as I said, that willingness in certain categories to pay a bit more. So maybe I might be going out less often, but when I go out, I really want to enjoy myself. And it's not just, the big spenders, the high rollers that want to do this. But there's also something very interesting around willingness to and a desire to be shown new things so that you can trial them. So drinkers have really registered a significant increase in this kind of interest in newness and show me something different and I'll be open to try it, much more so than even 12 months ago.
Right. And what the things that I'm about to say, it's purely based off a hunch. I don't have the data, but you work with that data. The first is the sheer number of brands available seems to be growing and growing and growing. And I can imagine that that's going to have an effect on people when they try new things. They're now seeing so many different things. I imagine that they may be more willing to try new things. But conversely, you could see how people would potentially go into a bit of a shell and go, this is the brand I like, I'm just drinking that. So have you seen the opposite change occur as well? Or is it just the trend is just saying people are willing to try more products?
It, again, very much depends on the category, the venue, the drinker. In some instances, there is, to pardon the pun, almost this unquenchable thirst for more innovation. You like that? It's good, isn't it? So in RTDs, ready-to-drink categories, generally speaking, targeted or aimed at a younger audience, and there is a real lust for newness, new flavors, new varieties, new variants. Yeah, you give it to me and I'll take it and I'll have a go. Conversely, and this really stands out, and you'd probably look at this and go, yeah, I get that. But if I was talking to a beer drinker in an RSL, it's not the same at all, right? There, I want to know that the thing that I like is going to be on tap, and it's going to be there consistently. I don't want that other thing. I want to know that my favorite is there. And there's a gamut, there's a range and a spectrum of everything in between. So the truth really is in the fact that you can probably make some assumptions around that, but you can't guess it consistently across different venues and across multiple different categories all the time. You have to be able to go in and say, right, if I look at that objective sample of people, what is the trend? Because at either ends of that spectrum, I can see more. As I say, overall, there is more of a sense of trial in the on-premise.
Is what you're seeing that people are willing to trial or that they want to trial? Because I think that distinction is important in how venues make their purchasing decisions, because if they've only got so much limited back bar space, if it is wanting to trial new products, what would the future of that experience really look like?
So the answer to that question is both, in fact, because there's two different questions there. There is, how do you approach a category? And one of the responses there is, I approach it with an open-mindedness to trying new stuff. And therefore, if you make that visible to me, then I'm more likely versus less likely to give it a go. And then there's another question, which is slightly different, which is how important is that trial and that innovation to you in the category? So actually, it's both aspects. It's both, yeah, I'm open to it. If you make it visible, and of course, then you want to get into, well, how do I make it visible? Is it behind the bar? Is it on the bar? Is it at the table? Is it pre-venue even? So all those different points on the path to consumption, you could influence me. You could show me that opportunity, that newness. And then there is that other bit, the second bit about how important it is. So there's, I can show you something new, or I do actually want newness in this category. Two slightly different things. Both are covered. And then, of course, the final part of that, which links back into satisfaction, is if it's important to me in RTDs to have innovation, new products, rotation of different flavors, how well is that being delivered in bars? And how does that compare versus pubs? And what does that mean for me as a supplier? Should I be pushing that more? As a venue, should I be opening out more space for those products? And the answer, generally speaking, in RTDs is probably yes, by and large. Then it goes into a lot more nuance around, is it bottles, is it cans, and so on and so on and so on. But some fascinating things there.
I'm glad you brought up satisfaction again, because that was the second of 2 points that we had a chat about just earlier. I wanted to dig a little bit further into this on-prem versus off-prem satisfaction. A question that I have is, could consumers' expectations have just decreased and therefore they're more satisfied now with the on-prem experience?
Yeah, look, I suppose there could be some truth to the idea that the on-prem and bars and clubs and restaurants and so forth were not delivering as well. There's also, I would say, an interesting point there around the off versus the on experience. And it probably goes back in part to what you just described there, is if you keep adding more to the offer, is that always good? Do people in general just want more and more and more? Just chuck it all out there and that's fine. And this is where the two do, again, interlink in a very interesting way, because what we've seen shoppers in the off-prem telling us over the last sort of 18 months or so is in certain categories, and there are some RTD categories in there, interestingly enough, more does not necessarily mean better. And there's this inflection point at which it starts to become a little bit aggravating, and there's too much there. And actually the things that I was starting to get to like have now gone. Those products aren't available anymore because there's been too much rotation and too quick a rotation. So that has started to go on in the off-premise at the same time as you've seen the on-prem kind of bouncing back, improving executionally, delivery, service, and all those kind of aspects have improved. And we've also seen improvements in some of these areas around product and range and delivery of the drink itself. So a little bit of both, but I also would say that it's good news for the on-premise. I didn't expect to see these results this year, maybe not even this quickly. So it's testament to a lot of good work that's clearly gone on out there between venues and brands and suppliers. And it's a great launch pad to then get a bit more granular and really understand how and why this has happened and start to mine specifically what can we do more and differently in the coming 12 months.
Thanks for elaborating on that further, David. It's been really fascinating speaking with you about these sorts of topics today. I just have one last question for you on the program, and that's who would you like to hear on the show?
Who would I like to hear on the show? This is one that I hadn't prepped for, actually. I know that you were going to ask me that and I hadn't really thought about it. Who's the biggest name you can get on the show? We've had loads of, I come from the UK, of course. Been a few years since I've been there. I know Jamie Oliver was poking around on the local news over here and I thought, wow, haven't seen him for a while.
He had a restaurant group that I think went into administration or liquidated.
Yeah, there was this, I don't know what happened.
Well, we won't make any further comments on that.
No. I wonder if maybe Gordon Ramsay had similar sort of challenges. My kids love Gordon Ramsay. And maybe that would be an exciting one to get on here and have a chat with.
I would love to have Gordon Ramsay on the show. Thank you for the recommendation. It's been a pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for sharing your insights as well. I'm going to keep reading, and definitely listeners should read your posts, in particular on LinkedIn. You post a lot. It's really awesome. So you should definitely check that out and Shopper Intelligence and speak with you. So thank you very much for joining me on the show, David.
Thank you, mate. Appreciate the invite.
This program was produced by H Media. We'll see you soon.